technique to doing oral histories, aren't there?
Yes, there is.
How do you know them?
I've studied oral histories. I
Really?
write about it.
Where in school?
I use oral histories in my class.
You what?
I use oral histories in my classes.
What?
When I teach sociology of race and ethnicity.
But where'd you learn it?
Okay, this is part of the oral history project for the 50th anniversary. I'm Carol Pohl. I'm doing the interviewing.
Will you speak a little louder?
I teach sociology, and doing the camera work is Terry Cadigan. We're interviewing Jeanette Jarnow on December 20th, 1994, and I'm going to turn the camera over to her. If you would tell us your name, when you began teaching and working with FIT.
My name is Jeanette Jarnow, and I began teaching in September 1956 at FIT. And my first job was as something called a coordinator of a brand new merchandising, what was going to be a brand new merchandising department. There wasn't any department until then.
And what was the college like then?
Small. Everybody knew everybody else. The faculty knew everybody, each other. All the students knew each other. I think the faculty knew every student in school. And I think everybody was very familiar with all the courses that were being taught. Today, of course, we're not sure what's going on in all the departments. But then you knew everything that was going on. We all shared an office with a telephone, so you knew everybody's private life as well as their professional goings-on.
What building was that in?
We were in the high school building on 24th Street between 7th and, where are we going now? 7th and 8th. And we had one office on the main floor. I know I had half a desk to begin with. And the dean was on that floor. The whole college, all the administration was on the main floor, and there was some classrooms above.
And how did you happen to come to FIT, to work with FIT?
I had retired from business. I had retired from Abraham and Strauss, where I had been a merchandise manager. And one of the executives told me I was interested in teaching. I was interested in a part-time job. That's what I was looking for. I had 2 young children. I was not interested in full-time work. But I wanted a part-time job of some kind. And they told me that there was a school called FIT, which I had never heard of, looking for people who had industry experience, and that's really how I heard of it. Actually, FIT, I think, contacted industry looking for people.
When you say industry, what industries?
I'm talking about the fashion industry. That's the word. That's our Bible in the school, isn't it? So when we say industry, we mean fashion industry.
And who contacted the fashion industry? Do you know the names of the people?
Well, basically, it was Rosalind Snyder at first, who was dean of the college, and her assistant, a lady by the name of Molly Sloman, Slonin.
Do you know how FITs got started?
I always hear that it was over which I don't know whether you've heard, over a bologna sandwich. I don't know if you've heard that story.
Or pastrami.
With Virginia Pope and a lot of industry executives.
Who was
You know, I don't know whether they told you about the name FIT, that they wanted a college for, the industry, the fashion industry, had a very bad reputation. I mean, that wasn't a bad reputation. They were called the rag business at that time by some people. And they wanted to give it some status and prestige. They were also interested in keeping the industry in New York and having a school. And as I heard it, somebody said, well, MIT is a school for engineering and a very prestigious school. Why can't we have something like an FIT instead of an MIT, and we would be the school for the fashion industry? Hasn't anybody ever told you that story? How we got our name?
Version of it.
Yeah.
Yes. Who was Virginia Pope? You mentioned Virginia
Well,
Pope.
Virginia Pope was an editor of the New York Times, a very well-known lady, very respected lady, fashion editor of the New York Times, and she was very involved in our school, as were many other fashion people. They really called in the industry to support them. When I say they, there were two men, I believe. It was Morris Haight and Samuel Deach. I don't know how to spell his last name. Who were, along with, I'm not sure, Max Meyer, who I think was an academic person, who were the three movers, as I understand it, and they worked with, contacted industry people to help them get started.
And what were the early programs that were offered in the school?
Well, when I was there, when I came in, there was a management, or I forget what, I think it was called management. Industrial management, I think was the name of it. There was what was called design, fashion design, which is really apparel design, and art, fashion art. I'm not sure whether pattern, I don't think there was a program like pattern making or anything like that. I really don't know. And what somebody had gotten an idea that they would offer the marketing, or what it was then called, nobody knew what it was going to be called, merchandising, for lack of another word right now, offered some merchandising courses to design students who, since they were going out into industry, ought to know what was happening to the merchandise they were designing. And that would have been merchandising. We didn't have a program. We started with a one-year program, I don't know whether you know that, offered to design students as an option. In other words,
Or the
normally it
merchandising
was
program?
yes. There was a lot of discussion about what to call it, but that's what we ended up. The reason it was called fashion buying and merchandising was they felt that if recruitment people were going to go out to the high schools, if you used the word buying, people would know what you were talking about. Students would. And if they just used the word merchandising, because I once heard that word defined as a big word in search of a meaning, nobody was quite sure what it was. I'm not even sure they're sure today. Do you know what it means? It's a word that a lot of people don't understand. They understand marketing. Merchandising is part of marketing, but they didn't understand the word merchandising. So the program was called Fashion Buying and Merchandising.
What were the industry influences then on the shaping of these new programs?
Oh, tremendous. It was great on the other programs, but on our program it was tremendous. We used industry constantly. We used them to recruit teachers, help us get teachers, to do guest speakers, to formulate our courses. I don't think we put in a new course without starting with an industry committee.
Can you mention some of the industries that you've been involved in?
Well, I'll start with the retailers, because Bergdorf Goodman, who endowed the Institute with money for this program, was very active and very involved in it. Lord and Taylor was very involved. Abraham and Strauss of Brooklyn was very involved with it. Bloomingdale's was involved. We even have our amphitheater is named after a Bloomingdale executive. I don't know whether you know that. The Katie Murphy Theater, or Amphitheater. And Katie Murphy was a fashion director at Bloomingdale's.
Do you remember who some of the names in Lord and Taylor and A&S? Or Andrew Goodman was from Bergdorf Goodman.
Yes.
His father was a founder of,
Edwin Goodman, yes.
and some of the names from Lord and Taylor and Amos.
The name I think I remember best is Melvin Dawley. Spelled the last name Dawley. The names from Abraham and Strauss was Melvin Dawley was the president, I think. Sidney Solomon of Abraham and Strauss, also the president. We only went to the presidents. Well, they're the most influential. Actually, if we go a little further, we have teachers come to us from Abraham and Strauss. They loaned us faculty. We called them for faculty who had industry experience, and they loaned us a gal by the name of Gilda Smithline, who I think is still around maybe somewhere, who was in the advertising department, and she came over twice a week to teach. I don't even think we paid her. I don't remember that.
What were the students like then? Who were the students who were going? Mostly New York City students?
They were all New York.
Mostly women?
Actually, we really have very few relatively metropolitan students. They're mostly from either Long Island or, I'm not talking about now, but then even, they were either from Long Island or the suburbs I'm talking about. We had Jersey students too. Even today, I would say the majority of students are not from the metropolitan area. They're from Brooklyn or, as I say, the suburbs.
What do you mean, not from Manhattan?
Not from Manhattan.
From the outer boroughs?
Yep.
And if you think about, I'm a sociologist, and if you think about them in terms of their backgrounds, were they the first generation college
Yes.
students?
They were then. That was in, when, 50?
Yeah.
Yes. Most of them were first generation college.
From immigrant families, do you think?
Well, wasn't everybody in New York basically an immigrant family, I think? Is that so or not? You're a sociologist. Yes or no?
It's a high proportion, yes. There is. New York City has the highest proportion of immigrants compared to any other city.
Well, immigrants now you're talking
Now
about.
and in the past, it's always been a mecca for immigrants. Mostly, what countries were they from?
Not the Orient, which we have now. I would, now we're not talking about the students.
Students, I'm trying
No,
to.
the students were not from a foreign country.
Oh, they're from families, though?
Their parents were.
The parents, yeah.
Yeah. Now, do you want to know their background?
Yeah.
My guess is that there were a great many Italian families. Funny. I can't speak for the rest.
And mostly females in the school.
Yes. We had a big problem, and we still have getting males because of the name. I don't know whether you know or anybody talked about all the efforts in our school to change that name, to get the word fashion out of it. I mean, there is a whole contingent of people from every year that wanted to get the word fashion out of the name of our college.
Why is that?
Because, well, I don't know whether it was because they said it wouldn't attract males. It didn't sound academic to them. And yet, that was what made our college what it is, that word fashion, and it's a major industry of the United States. It's a major industry in the world.
What changes have you seen at FIT? You were there for a good span of time. When did you leave FIT?
This year.
This year. So you saw how long, many years is it?
38 years.
38
A lot
years.
of change.
Okay. If you could just talk about some of the
start, first of all, it's grown like topsy, all right, in terms of numbers. Secondly, in terms of programs, we have added a tremendous amount of programs. I'm not quite sure how many we have right now, maybe you know, but we've gone from maybe originally 4 or 5 to somewhere, I don't know, maybe 30. I have no idea exactly what you can fill that number in. Also, within even the existing programs, the ones that started, there were many changes because the industry changed tremendously. And so there were many changes. We've always tried to keep up with the industry. So as the industry has changed, job opportunities for students have changed, the courses have changed. And of course we have a great many out-of-town students and out-of-country students that we never had. Great many foreign and out-of-town students. We also have, as you know, it started with a 2-year program for everybody. We have 4-year programs. We have 1-year programs. We have a graduate program, which is growing, so that we have enlarged our degrees, many more than we used to give. I don't know where else we've changed in every way you can possibly imagine.
I understand the early days we had a dress code for students.
I think all schools had a dress code. We had a dress code in that whenever we took students on field trips, which we did a lot of, they had to wear hats and gloves. And like many other schools, we did
And skirts, I assume, hats, gloves.
did not allow students to wear pants. I guess that was our dress code.
When did that change?
I imagine in the late 50s, I don't know. Certainly in the 60s, with the whole do-it-yourself thing going on.
And the guys had to wear suits and jackets.
No, I don't think they had to wear jackets. I'm not sure if everybody had to wear ties. One department always made them wear ties. That was the management department. It's now called the production department.
And I assume the dress code and all this was also a reflection of the image that FIT wanted to project with its students.
I'm not quite sure what you mean.
I mean, since it's a school of fashion, I assume the dress code was also...
No, I don't really. You know, it's funny. I don't think so. I don't think we ever insisted or talked about the students wearing the current fashions. I don't think so. I don't ever remember that. I don't ever think, I still don't think our students are the most fashionable there are. I mean, every school has its own expression. And ours does too.
Can you think about some key events in the history of FIT that you think should be part of the archives?
Well, I don't think you would consider our fundraising dinner certainly was a key event. It's an annual thing, we still have it. And that's a key event. Actually, it used to be held right when we moved into the new building. It was held right in our lobby.
Why is it a key event? Why?
Well, it raises a terrific amount of money. It gets us a great deal of publicity. I guess those are the two reasons, the money and the publicity. As far as other key events, well, we've got a lot of events going on. We have seminars, and I know of one that we had in the auditorium was overrun, which is a lot of people coming in from outside. Any special events? I really can't think of any one. There were so many going on. I mean, we've had TV programs. We've had a great many seminars. We've had a lot of prominent guest speakers. We have a lot of prominent guests.
So mention some of them, describe some of
The
them.
guest speakers? Well, I can tell you about the merchandising department. We were very dependent on industry. We did a great many field trips to retailers and wholesalers, and we had a lot of guest speakers coming in. We had, I believe, almost the president of almost every retail store come in and talk to our students. Over the period of years, we've had designers coming in to talk to the students. Every well-known designer. I think if you mention a name, they've been there, including foreign. We've even had Yves Saint Laurent was at our school for an evening. Givenchy was at our school for a guest speaker. That was for the whole school. In terms of, well, I don't know whether you'd call field trips. I don't know who else to tell you. In other words, guest speakers. Almost every president of every store has been there.
And they do this pro bono. Do they charge everything?
There's no charge at all.
And it's through the contacts in the department that you reach out?
Yes, departments, and then at one point we had somebody who did nothing but that. I don't know whether you know that Dorothy Hannenberg at one time, until fairly recently, was in charge of what we call our field trip program and guest speaker program. She made the contact for us. We had to work through her, otherwise everybody would be calling the same person. But
Is that for your department,
and
Dorothy?
now I think the departments are doing it.
Dorothy Hannenberg was for the school or for the department?
School. She also taught there. She was a teacher in the art department, the design department, or had been, but that became a full-time job. Virginia Pope ran a wonderful program for our students. I don't know whether you know that. Honor students. There were a certain amount of students from each department that she took every semester to major events, social events around the city. She used to take them to the opera, for example, so they would see where fashion was being worn. She used to take them to the horse show, the very society kind of events. All kinds of shows, the animal shows or the dog shows. She would take students there, and they would write reports for her. And she did that weekly.
Could you talk about the different positions you've had at FIT?
Me?
Yes.
I really haven't had many. I started as something called a coordinator because there is no such thing as a chairman unless you have a certain amount of people in your department. And then I became the chairman of the department. I'm not even sure what year, but quite early. Possibly in the early 60s. And I was a chairman until, I'm trying to think when. In 1986, I retired as chairman and went back to teaching. And that's been my job. I've been chairman all the time until I became a teacher again.
Were you first selected as chairman by the administration president?
Yes.
And then it became an elected position?
I'm trying to think when elections came in. I don't know if I was ever. I guess so. I mean, that's a dumb thing to say, but I guess so. Yeah.
And what courses in particular did you teach?
Well, I guess at one time I taught every course. I didn't teach them all at one time, but I certainly taught every course that was offered in the department as they became available. And the last few courses as a teacher that I taught were mostly an introduction to the industry. It was a marketing course and a merchandising math course.
Okay.
Which is largely a retailing course.
We're basically winding down in terms of the oral history. Is there something you think should be part of the record of the history of FIT?
Say that again.
We're winding down in terms of the oral history. Are there some things that you think should be included in the history of FIT that you'd like to tell us about?
You know, one of the things you never talked about, which has not to do with, well, it doesn't, are our publications by faculty of FIT that are being used in other schools. I mean, in other words, I believe that almost every school considers FIT a leader in anything to do with fashion and many of the courses because they follow our courses. We've been influential in setting up programs in other countries. Do you know that? In other words, FIT has set up a fashion programs on design and marketing in Italy, in India. We have an exchange program with London. Actually, it's really not an exchange program. We have a program where our students go. We don't get their students. But we've had a tremendous influence on I would say on merchandising programs all over the country and even in Europe. I think Al Sloan may have given you the figures. I think he said that when we started a merchandising program, and this is merchandising again, but it has implications for FIT. There was one merchandising program, ours, or two maybe, and there's something like 200 now. And they've all been really based on copy from FIT. So I think that we are a leader in our field, both domestic and foreign. We do seminars in Europe. I think you know that, in Japan.
You mentioned the publications. Is there some publications you think that you want to identify?
Well, I'm going to talk about one of mine, which I think is the leading one in its field. That's Inside the Fashion Business, which is in its 5th edition. It's now published by, they just changed it. Paramount bought, it was Macmillan, but Paramount bought Macmillan. I think Prentice Hall is doing it. I'm not sure. We better put Macmillan, because I don't know who they've changed to. Art Winters done a publication that is used all over also. He was in our department, in the merchandising department, and we kind of assigned him to do it, write a book. And that is used. I don't know about publications in other departments that are as widespread.
Could you describe your book? What the themes are in the book that you wrote and why you wrote it?
The interesting thing is why I wrote it. We had a request from an encyclopedia, it came through our president's office, to give them a little story about, or a current update on the fashion industry. That was President Bethel. And he asked me to do it. To get it together, it was supposed to be a paragraph or two. And the amazing thing was I couldn't find anything. In other words, it seemed to me an industry that is probably the 3rd or 4th largest in this country there wasn't any information about it in any publication other than magazines. And so I decided we've got to write a book about it. And that's what we did. And it's in its 5th edition. And I think it's been the best one in its field. And as far as what it's about, it's really a text and readings. In other words, it discusses or describes every division of the industry. Its economics, its history and development, and its current status. And then the readings are either reprints or written for the book about well-known companies in the field. So it's a story of the industry. It's economics and history. And it's used in many schools, many colleges. Now I'll tell you who else wrote a book that's good, and this current one is Elaine Stone. Elaine Stone has done a book currently on exports and imports. Previous to that, she did a book on, I think it's called, I'm not sure, it may be called Fashion Merchandising, which also has been a big seller, or used a great deal. So whatever publications we've done in our department has influenced FIT, has influenced FIT's influence on other schools. I mean, FIT is one of a kind. There's no school in the world or in the country like it. And I think a lot of people are trying to imitate it, both abroad and in this country.
Is there anything else you'd like to talk about in terms of oral history, capturing the history of FIT?
We touched upon the development, the changing nature of the students, the expansion of the school.
Well, I think of course, what is interesting about its whole development is we are attracting students from all over the world. In addition to European students from Europe, we have a great many from the Orient. Both full and part-time. And as far as, I think our faculty are remarkable. They've all got industry experience. They're all still active in industry. They must have industry. I mean, they're not an academic, they're academically correct. But they must have industry experience. And I think the students respect FIT for that. They really do. I think it's really a remarkable school. I don't know how strongly academic people feel about, the academic people within FIT feel about FIT. Truly. I mean, in other words, we've had work-study programs which many of the people in the academic departments in a way resent because the students are out of school.
In the liberal arts department?
Yeah. I don't know whether they think the industry is that important or an industry education is that important. You know, I don't think anybody has to go to FIT to make it out there. I never did. I'm a liberal arts graduate. And I believe that's still true. I mean that if a student is motivated, the education is not necessarily a professional one. That's fine if you want to be a lawyer or a doctor, but if you want to be a merchant or a marketer, you don't have to go to a school like ours. You can go to a liberal arts college and get your training out in industry. I don't know whether that's putting it down for FIT, but that's, I think, important to say that we don't think that it's the beginning and end of everything, but it certainly is the beginning. It makes anybody, it'll give every student an edge or a motivation to go into that business. And we have students all over the place. They've become teachers, they've become buyers, they've become advertisers, they've become research people. There seems to be no limit to the careers that the graduates have gone into. Really.
You mentioned your background in terms of liberal arts.
Yeah, I come from Barnard. I have a bachelor's from Barnard and a master's from Long Island University. From Long Island,
And what was your major at Barnard?
psych,
And your master's?
business.
Is there anything else you'd like to add to?
I don't know if there is. I can't think. What would you like to know?
It's been fascinating what you said. You traced the history of FIT, so okay. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. You know that there are archives. Do you know that somebody did an oral history of FIT? They told you that.
But now that FIT, they've done some oral histories in the library.
Yes, there is. Okay.
Yeah.
Gal by the name of Mildred Finger did it.
What started that project?
I don't know. No idea.
Was she an FIT faculty?
No. No. Not at all. And she wasn't even trained in taking oral history.